Hi, and welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our weekly look at the Catholic intellectual tradition and an exploration of the authors, books, and topics that have shaped Catholic thinking for 2,000 years. My name is Jason Gale, and I'm joined this week by Dr. Benjamin Smith, their lecturer in philosophy at Catholic Studies Academy here. And we're excited today to do two things. The first thing is to let you know that Dr. Smith's book is available on Amazon. You can get it in the nice, handy little paper format, which for our listeners, before the internet, there used to be this stuff called paper, and on this paper they put words. When they put these words on paper together, they called them books. But you can also get Dr. Smith's book also in the Kindle format, and so check it out at Amazon.com. The book is called Understanding Modern Political Ideas, a guidebook for Christians and other patriots. And it's a great read. It's accessible, which is always difficult now to try to wrap your head around big philosophical, especially when philosophy enters the world of politics, to try to wrap your head around these ideas. Dr. Smith has done, I think, a phenomenal job of not just diagnosing some of the issues with problematic philosophical ideas with regards to politics, but he gives some very good solutions and critiques. But he also does it in an honest way, where he doesn't just write them off. He examines them very good. So the other thing we want to do today, another small task, is we're going to tackle the topic of providence, especially during a time of uncertainty or a time of where we may think there may be some sort of tribulation. I'm not talking about like Revelation, end times, things like that, but just general uncertainties, right, between the pandemic, the election, just personal issues that I think people are going through, with all the added stress of just everything. I think it just kind of throws people into a world that they probably never thought they'd find themselves.
Right.
I honestly, in 2019, I would have never said, 2020, it's going to be, that's right. I mean, the most useless thing that, you could have bought this year was a daily planner, right? So nobody's buying a daily planner for 2021. Although I might get that for a gag gift for some people.
Right, I like that idea. That's cool.
All right, but Dr. Smith, let's go ahead and tackle this topic of divine providence. So to get us kicked off and to work towards kind of a common definition and a common understanding, so we can talk about it. What are some of kind of the first things that we have to understand with regards to understanding God as providential?
Well, so I think a good place to begin, Jason, is with God and with what St. Thomas Aquinas has to say about God. I think the St. Thomas is very instructive and helpful on these matters. St. Thomas, his St. Thomas has a lot of works. His sort of essential go-to work is, of course, the Summa Theologia. It's divided up into different parts. The part where St. Thomas deals with God is in the Prima Pars. That is the creative name, the first part.
Who says scholastics are dry? Come on.
That's right. Whenever people give me a hard time about having dry titles, I'm like, Summary of Theology, Part 1. So anyways, back then I guess I didn't care about titles having marketing appeal. But it's in the first part of the Summa, and those questions, I think it's questions like 1 through 29, I think, if I remember correctly, somewhere around there. Just really masterful treatment of questions about God. Some of St. Thomas's finest work, I think, in terms of just deductive logic and clarity of definition. So in that work, of course, a lot of people are immediately drawn to the early questions excuse me, about, whether you can prove the existence of God, And of course, St. Thomas, argues that, the existence of God may be known by right reason, as reason used properly. Um, and we've talked about some of those proofs in the past, so we don't need to belabor it here. But the general way that those arguments work is they move from effects to a cause. Right? So they move from what we can observe in the world to a necessary and sufficient explanation.
Yeah.
And, not surprisingly, St. Thomas concludes, like most philosophers historically have concluded, that there must be some sort of first cause, right? So that there is a being who is the cause of all other causes, right? So first cause here doesn't necessarily mean first in a sequence.
Right.
It doesn't exclude that, but it doesn't. That's not what is primarily intended. It means that God is the primary cause, and all other causes are secondary causes. That is, all other causes depend upon the prior causality of God.
And I'm going to stop you right there. Like what you just said there, and you kind of went over it quickly. That's something that I constantly have to remind myself, and when I'm talking with others, to try to clarify, we're not talking sequential here. God is not the finger that knocks over the first domino.
Correct.
So when we're talking about first, again, it's not this, sequential pattern where, God says something and then da 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 da. That's not what we mean. It's
right.
Not in a sequence like that.
Yeah, the way to think about it, I think, is to think about it as levels of causality, right? So if you think about, say, the way that electrical power works inside of a watch, right? That might be something people aren't familiar with. There's a thing you put on your wrist, right? Where it has hands that move across the dial, right? It tells time.
Right up there with paper.
That's right. But interestingly, right, it's you think about the way a watch works and the way the hands move across the face of the watch or the clock. There's a lot of gears that are at work there, right? And so you could talk about the kind of causality that's operated by the gears in the watch, right? But that level and that's a real level of causality. So that's important, right? The gears are real causes of the watch working. At the same time, if it's an electrical watch, ultimately those gears and their function depends upon the electricity stored in the battery, right?
Right.
So you have kind of a mechanical level of causality, and then you have an electrical level of causality, and that mechanical level depends upon the electrical, right? So
yeah, sure, that's good.
An analogy, but that gets you the idea that there are levels of causality, right?
Yeah. No, that's a great way to understand it, I think. So God is first cause, and he's the first cause of all other causes.
That's right. Now he doesn't, in doing that, he doesn't, God doesn't, God's first causality does not negate secondary causality. Secondary causality is still causality. It's real. It's just dependent causality, right? Whereas God's causality is independent. God's causality doesn't depend on a prior cause, whereas secondary causes do depend on a prior cause, including human causality, right? Depends on that primary cause. So God alone, right, is fully independent in his causality. Secondary causes are real causes, but they are in fact dependent causes. So that kind of lays, I think, the philosophical kind of groundwork, right, to the doctrine of divine providence. Does that make sense? Do you have any questions about that?
There has to be that first cause in order to understand any other intermediate causes. That gives us, some point of direction as to understanding God as providence. So he's the first cause of everything. And I know people immediately want to jump to evil the problem of evil. But we'll slowly work there. But so from there, from understanding God is first cause, how do we make the move then to God is provident? Right.
Good. All right. So this question is treated, I think, beautifully by St. Thomas in question 22 of the first part of the Summa. Mm-hmm. When I teach St. Thomas in undergraduate, like I say, an introduction to philosophy class, I almost always teach this question because it's one that really, stimulates the mind. And I think gives you a picture. It's really interesting. Gives you a picture of the world that is kind of startling, right? There's a tendency, I think, among undergraduate students, and really for everybody, to think, oh yeah, God and the world. Okay, yeah, got it. I believe in God, all right, or I don't believe in God, or maybe I believe in God. Some days I believe in God, whatever. But the implications, right, of believing in God, mm-hmm. right, I think are often they're not really grasped, right? That like what's being implied here, like what's on the table is not just, oh, I'm going to add one entity to my table of entities of what's in the universe, right? It's not like, oh, okay, well, I'll add God, right? There's Benjamin, there's his two sons, there's his friend Jason, and also God. Right? Yeah. Like no, it's much more fraught. It's much more it's laden, right? With consequences than we tend to think. And the question of providence really brings that out, right? Yeah. And so, St. Thomas, when he's dealing with this, right? So he's already got in the background first causality, mm-hmm. and obviously God's existence. And so he asks, well, is God provident for things, right? Mm. He asks whether God is provident for things. And of course, his answer is going to be yes. Why is that the case? So what St. Thomas wants to point to, and again, he's always a good a posteriori, empirically minded, experience-oriented kind of guy, which I appreciate. He's not into sort of a priori fantasies. But anyways, he says, look, the world is ordered, right? Mm-hmm. Effects are ordered, causes are ordered to their effects. Mm-hmm. We don't live in a world of random chaos. Yeah. We don't live in an anarchy. We live in a well-ordered world, right? So what does this look like? Well, it just doesn't happen to be the case that acorns give rise to oak trees, right? It's rather that acorns are ordered to giving rise to oak trees, right? Yeah. It doesn't just happen that the eye is perfectly attuned to bringing about sight as an organ, right? Rather, the eye is designed and ordered to the effect of seeing, okay? That's the way St. Thomas sees it. Now, I will concede that there is a different possibility. I think it's a self-defeating possibility, mm-hmm. But that's the non-teleological world, right? Now, maybe I need to define.
Yeah, what do you mean by that? Yeah,
teleological. So, telos is a Greek word, and logia is a Greek word. Teleological means structured towards ends, right? Mm-hmm. Now, I don't mean ends again in sequence. I mean ends in terms of like purposes or goals, right? So St. Thomas, and this is true of the entire medieval and ancient world, or almost all philosophers in the ancient medieval world, held the view that the world, the physical world, right, is teleological. That is, it is not random. It mm-hmm. has purpose embedded within it, right?
Right.
Now, the other view, right, is a view you can find in the ancient world, but also in the modern world. You could have a Lucretian view or a Darwinian view, or a view like Democritus, right? So the atomist of the ancient world, or the evolutionist of the present times. By evolution here, I'm not simply talking about the idea of one species becoming another, but evolution is the philosophy in which you think the changes are themselves random. Mm-hmm. So the alternative, with respect to the eye, right, is to say, oh, well, it just shook out that eyes, some species through random mutation, random genetic mutation, and the collision with environment, some species developed eyes, and eyes are more well adapted towards survival than non-eyes, and therefore the eyed animals survived and the non-eyed predecessors did not.
Yeah.
And so that's a story you can tell yourself, if you like. Some people do like that. I don't know, anyways, but
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
bedtime stories for agnostics, I guess. Anyways, St. Thomas has the much more rational view that no, it didn't just shake out that way, right?
Yeah.
Rather, the world is ordered. Now, I want to say, besides kind of being a little dismissive here, I want to say more seriously and substantially, that kind of extreme evolutionist view, extreme random view, I think is ultimately self-defeating, right? That is,
Sure.
Because what you end up with is a view of rationality that's not necessarily ordered towards truth, right? And if reason's not ordered towards truth, then science is false or it's unreliable. And if that's true, so is the very theory of evolution itself. So I think, you have to kind of recognize that extreme evolutionism, maybe I'll make it an ism to try to clarify what I'm talking about, that extreme random, endorsement of randomness, right, ultimately undermines the reliability of reason. And if you undermine the reliability of reason, you also undermine the reliability of science itself. So I don't think it's just a matter of plopping down for St. Thomas because he's a saint. It's actually, that's the rational option. The other option is irrational. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And the job of the extreme evolutionist is to try to place an ordered explanation on random chaos.
Right.
Again, when you're talking about self-defeating, there's a job that will frustrate you to hell. I mean,
that's right. I mean, what you end up with is, and this is not a unique way of putting it myself, but there's a thinker who I don't normally agree with. He's kind of a Protestant philosopher or apologist named Cornelius Van Til. But he has a nice way of putting something. He talks about the rational, irrational dialectic. And I think that's a good way of talking about the evolutionist, right, on the extreme side, where you have, you have disorder and irrationality and randomness. And then you're going to explain it, just like you were saying, through rationality. Well, those are category differences that just, you can't overcome that kind of antithesis, right?
Right.
So for the record, a rare moment of me saying something affirmative about the thought of Cornelius Van Til to all my Reformed friends out there. But anyways, so St. Thomas, right, is with the wise and holds for that the world is ordered, right? And certainly from a Christian perspective, you have to hold that that's the case. You can't hold that God, just decided to create things without order, right? Like God was just like, just throw some matter around and see what happens, right? It's not a Jackson Pollock painting, right?
Yeah, well, and I think, it doesn't even take a Christian to understand that. I mean, the fact that we have science books, which are ordered explanations of the world around us, or the fact that we have an entire channel dedicated to the weather. It's, when we look at something and we say, a hurricane is going to hit, New Orleans, we don't say, but it may also hit Nevada. We just don't know.
It's just gonna skip.
Yeah, we're gonna put Montana under a hurricane watch because the weather, because nature is so unpredictable, it could literally land. No, we know for a fact that a hurricane will never hit Montana. So I mean, when you look at the world around you, it's ordered to a certain way to where we're even able to predict things with fairly clear percentages of reliability. I can look up what time the sun will set and what time the sun will rise, and again, because there's an order to it. And we just kind of discovered that and begin to make sense of it. And we at some point we put it into books and teach courses on it. It's supremely ordered, it's so I mean, it's something that I think even the non-Christian,
sure. Absolutely.
It's so difficult to avoid that. You can't.
Yeah, I agree. So with that premise in place, right, then we say, okay, well, who is the cause of the order of things, not just the being of things, but the order of things? Well, God is the first cause of all things, right? Yeah. Including their order, right? So when you're thinking about being provident, right, that's almost like it's almost like a simile of the word. I think simile is the correct way of putting it. Of the word prudence, right? Yeah. You are a father, so you're prudent over your household, right? That is, you don't just sort of, like when you're a father, you don't just sort of like create children and say, well, hope all this goes well, right? You don't just sort of buy a house and just say, they were done, Yep. No, like you have to pay the mortgage, right? And you have to prepare means to pay the mortgage, right? And you have to, maintain the lawn, and you have to repair things and get appliances, and make sure you pay the electricity bill so that you have electricity coming to your home, right? Once you have a family, once you have a home, you have to be prudent or provident for it, right? Yeah. You order the things in your home and in your family life towards certain ends. And this is the key point, prepare means to those ends, right? Yeah. The part of prudence is not just to recognize that, oh, I've got the goal of paying the electricity bill. Good. How? Yeah. Right? Does that make sense, right?
Yeah,
so go ahead.
And I was going to say this principle, I mean, it flows into all sorts of different areas of theology as well. The Catechism has one of my favorite quotes is in paragraph 2221 that says the fecundity of conjugal love, right? Fancy way of, there's some words to impress your friends at Thanksgiving, if you can have that. The fecundity of conjugal love,
Thanksgiving's canceled.
That's right. It's all canceled. You can impress them on Zoom, right? But that the fruitfulness of marital love doesn't terminate in just bringing the child into existence,
right?
But extends into the moral formation and education of the children. So it's their continued development, that the maintenance, if you want to put it that way, that even the maintenance falls within that aspect of it. So you see this kind of this idea of providence, really making its way through.
Right.
And you can look at all the sacraments in that way. I mean, why does God, there's a reason why God gives us, the gifts of the Holy Spirit at baptism and confirmation, right? They're not just nice symbols or something like that, but they're actual things to keep alive the grace that He has given us in that particular sacrament, and to do more and go beyond that. So
that's the life of the sacraments. I mean, all of that stuff, right? Is God prepares not just the ends, but the means to the ends, right? Yeah. And that belongs to His first causality, right? So it's not an accident, right, that the eye is ordered towards seeing. Rather, God willed that man be a seeing kind of animal, and therefore created eyes, right?
Yeah.
That's, we could have been like bats. It would be disturbing, but at least just kind of, maybe there's some problems with about saying that, but you could kind of imagine, anyways, just at the level of imagination, a sentient bat, and it not be eyed, but that was not God's will for us, right? And so, providentially, right, God prepared the means. Now, again, that's, that could give you a mistaken view, though, that in providence we're just talking about the design of nature.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not true, right?
Yeah.
God is the first cause of every effect, right? Let's let that sink in. God is the first cause of every effect. He's not the only cause, but he is the first cause, right? That includes, let me ask you, Jason, when you make a decision about going to work in the morning, is that an effect?
Sure. Absolutely.
Okay. So the conclusion is God is the first cause, right? of you going to work in the morning, right? That act of going to work in the morning, God's the first cause of it, right? God's the first cause of every change, of every effect, of every action and every passion, right? And so you gotta, that's kind of heavy, right? But that's true, right? And that means that God is also the cause of the means to that effect, right? If providence is true, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's also the cause of the secondary causes. He did all of them, both those that are stable, relatively stable in the design of nature, but also those that are contingent, right? Within your own life, or within history, or within the political life of a country, right? All of those things, right, are subject to God's providence, right? When Thomas asked, does providence include everything? He says, well, providence goes as far as causality. And since God's causality covers everything, God's providence covers everything, right? Not just the design of nature, that's important, but also history, right? And the story of mankind, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think to sometimes, ask the converse question. Okay, so if it's difficult to say that, or if it's difficult to understand that God is the first cause of everything, ask the other question: what if I were to determine what is outside of God's providence? What would that list be? That's I think a harder thing to grasp than to say I don't really understand how, but everything has to be in God's providence, because I can't make a list, start listing things that are not in God's providence. Well, the wood of my house, nope, that doesn't work. You can't. So maybe it's a beginning way to understand that everything is in there. So try to make a list of things that fall outside of God's providence.
Yeah. And the way to see that nothing's going to fall out of there, it's a great way of approaching it, Jason, is to ask, well, what is it that escapes God causality? And ask that is to ask, oh, so what is it that doesn't depend on God, right? And there you want to say nothing.
Yeah.
Right. Like everything depends on God. So maybe you need that double negative, right? to boot you over into seeing it the right way. But everything depends upon God. In his first causality, and therefore everything is subject to his providence, right?
Yeah.
I want to illustrate this with two examples I think might be helpful. Let's go with a positive one first. A lot of people have had the experience in their lives of maybe encountering a mentor, maybe a teacher or a coach or a priest or a pastor, right, who has put a lot of time and energy into them, and who really helped them grow in a significant way, right?
Yeah.
So we've all had this, I think about my father, I think about the pastor of the little church I grew up in, certain teachers, through my life, certain friends who acted as mentors, right? In a kind of unequal friendship, right? And that you experienced the deep growth, right? Out of that experience. And you might look back on it, right, and say, out of that relationship, I became a more mature man, or I became a more prudent man, or I became a man who cared about virtue. And, you might be grateful for that. And you might see, okay, the means of me growing in virtue in that instance was this coach or this teacher or this, parent. Okay, that is providence, right? God brought that about, right? He prepared not just the effect, you growing in virtue, but he also prepared the means to the effect, namely this particular relationship. And so you would say that's the work of God. That was part of providence. Thanks be to God, right?
Yeah.
For that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and you can also, put that with, the understanding that we were just talking about, that, that the relationship between the cause and effect, that for this person, you could say, like it seems at least that this person found, with regards to this part of God's will, that this person found that end, that this person, again, an intermediate end, not the final end or anything like that, but there was a realization to, there was kind of a finding a point where they went from kind of that potentiality, or I don't know if you want to say that, but kind of one cause to an effect to another cause, and you can really see the chain in that way, and how it makes sense.
Right.
And I think those are easy, because it seems that the causes and the effects are good.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
They're good. Yeah.
That's right. Good. Yeah. But important here, I think, to recognize, of course, if it's a particular, you want to recognize the causality, the secondary cause, right?
Yeah.
That is, you want to recognize, the mentor who helped you, but you also recognize that the mentor who helped you did so ultimately because God, right, caused the mentor to help you, right?
Yeah.
And so all glory to God, right, in the final analysis there. So that I love that passage in sacred scripture where it says that it's the Holy Spirit working in you both to will and to do, right?
Yeah.
You get that, not just to intend, but to act, right?
Yeah.
That's a powerful passage, I think, and I think that's the case with divine providence. Let's take a different case. It's harder. Let's think about a betrayal, maybe, right? So you have a friend, and that friend is somebody who you've been good friends, played an important role in your life. It's been a mutually beneficial relationship, that sort of thing, right? But then you trust that person, and that person happens to be somebody who's involved in financial investments, and you come into some money, and you're not exactly sure what to do with it yourself, right? And so because you have a friend who does have some financial expertise, you entrust that money to your friend, right, to invest on your behalf, right? Yeah. And do so with a clear conscience, and then a happy to have somebody that you trust take care of it, because you don't really know what to do with it, right? And so you're prudent enough that you're like, well, I don't want to just blow the money, right? So I don't, I'm not going to blow the money on my bass fishing boat, unfortunately. So you entrust that money to your friend to invest on your behalf. Unbeknownst to you, your friend is a con artist.
And he buys the best boat.
And he buys the best boat. That's right. Unbeknownst to you, your friend is actually a villain, right? In that sack, right? And so you eventually, you try to get the money back, and you can't find your friend. He's disappeared. He doesn't return your calls. He's fled to a foreign country, etc. Obviously, you're going to experience a lot of negative things. One, you've experienced the loss of your private property. You're going to feel angry, for sure. You're also going to feel sorrow. All those sorts of things, right? Yeah. So there are going to be changes, effects that have happened in your life. The loss of property, an increase in anger, experience of anger, etc. Right?
Yeah.
Pain at betrayal, right? Grief, at the loss of a friendship. Those are effects, right? So is God related? Are those effects related to God?
Yeah.
Yeah, they have to be, right? Because
They
God is the
have
first cause of every effect.
everything.
Right?
Yeah. Nothing is outside of the providence of God. Yeah.
That's right. And
Oh,
so
that's
God
hard.
prepares
Yeah.
not just the effects, but the means to the effects.
Yeah.
So, your friend's fraud and betrayal, that was part of providence too.
Mm-hmm.
So that's hard. So I know we don't want to just talk about the problem of evil, but we got to
You
talk
have
about
to.
it a little bit.
Yeah.
And I think, you might, I think it's fair to say in such a case, and if you pray the Psalms, this kind of comes across, right?
Mm.
God, what are you up to? Right?
Yeah, you're tapping on the mic. God, are you there?
Right. I think and I think it's totally legitimate, right? I think it's totally legitimate for us to say, I don't get this. Like,
Yeah.
why are you doing this? And it's really interesting, Jason. If you pray the Psalms faithfully, it's never the perspective of the psalmist to think, oh, well, God's not in control of that part. Right.
Yeah.
That part of the history of Israel, God's not really involved there. Right. No, it's never there are times where God brings the people of Israel low, right?
Mm-hmm.
Brings them into captivity. That wasn't an accident. That was part of God's plan. Right. And the Israelites at the time were like, what? What are you doing? But nowhere on the radar was the perspective of, well, this part wasn't really God, right?
Yeah.
That's just not the view of the Bible, not the view of the Psalms. So you have to have a view of providence robust enough to include the betrayal of your friend, to include the captivity of ancient Israel, right? To include the times where Israel fell away from God, right? And worshiped idols in the high places. That's a necessary part of the picture.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that you said earlier, I think for me, it's one of the keys to wrapping your mind around this situation, where bad things are happened, yet God is still provident. God is still good. Right. God is still is what you said earlier about God may be the first cause, but is he the only cause? No. And I think that's sometimes where people can fall into kind of this blame game with God. Right. Well, he could have stopped it, so he didn't, which means he doesn't care. And as and again, so ask yourself kind of the question: okay, what if God, did stop it in that way? Well, he'd be violating much of the order that he created in the world. Sure. And that order is good. Right. It just so happens that part of that order allows for bad things to happen.
Yes, that's right.
And I think one of the things that, just talking about the reasonableness of all this, that if God were to create order, but then interject into human history every time something bad was going to happen, or something we perceive bad was going to happen, that would in effect make the world complete disorder.
That's right. Exactly. Irrationality introduced.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, absolutely. That's right. And I think, Jason, that's key to remember. And I think it's also key, and this is tough, I get the toughness of it, but you just can't accept God's first causality, right? And deny the hard side of this, right? Yeah. Because then basically you're saying there's this part of the world where God's not the first cause, right? There's this part of reality where God's not really in charge, right? And no, that doesn't work. Sorry. Like metaphysically, that's absurd. And I grant that it's tough to accept that when your friend betrays you, it's part of God's plan, but it's part of God's plan. Now let me I'm going to just read here. I know that's not great podcasting practice, but I'm going to do it anyways. I'm going to read here what St. Thomas has to say. And Jason, I'll get, maybe you could put a link And
Sure.
for our listeners, this is in question 22 of the Summa, Article 2.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you know anything about the way St. Thomas writes in the Summa, he writes in a way that includes objections and replies to objections. So he asks the question, and then he lays out his own answer. But then he also looks at alternative views and tries to refute those alternative views.
Mm-hmm.
And so he brings up the objection. So in the question 2, he asks the question whether all things are subject to God's providence, right?
Mm.
And of course, he answers in the affirmative and says, the providence, it goes as far as causality. God's causality covers all. Therefore, God's providence covers all. But then, of course, he anticipates the objection, right? Well, God can't be the source of evil. God can't cause evil, and evil happens. So God's providence must not include evil, right?
Yeah.
And Thomas says, well, I object. So to the second. So I'm just going to read this.
Sure.
And maybe stop along the ways. But he says, it is otherwise with one who has care of a particular thing and one whose providence is universal. Because a particular provider excludes all defects from what is subject to his care as far as he can, whereas one who provides universally allows some defect to remain, lest the good of the whole should be hindered.
Mm.
It's an interesting thing to think about, right? Like say, imagine you're running a company, right? If you're the CEO, right, you're going to recognize that some departments are going to get more attention than others, right?
Yep.
Some employees are going to get more benefits than others. Some are going to get more resources than others. That in order for the whole thing to work, you can't make it be the case that there's no lack at all, right? Right? That sort of thing, right? That's what St. Thomas has in mind here. Hence, corruption and defects in natural things are said to be contrary to some particular nature. So what he has in mind is, like, so my eyes, right, are obviously bad eyes because that's the reason why I wear glasses, right? Okay, so hence corruption and defects in natural things are said to be contrary to some particular nature. It's contrary to the nature of the eyes to be deficient in seeing, but that's the way it is. Yet they are in keeping with the plan of universal nature.
Yeah.
Inasmuch as the defect in one thing yields to the good of another, or even to the universal good. So that's the key thing here, right? Inasmuch as the defect, right, in one thing yields to the good of another, or even to the universal good. For the corruption of one is the generation of another. And through this it is that a species is kept in existence. So think about the relationship between the wolf and the rabbit, right? The fact that there are rabbits, so the fact that there are wolves, for there to be wolves, it includes that some rabbits be eaten by wolves, right? Yeah. Now, obviously, the rabbits are not in favor of that. If you could ask them and they could respond, right? But it's for the good of the whole universe that there are both rabbits and wolves, right? And if there's going to be the good of wolves, then there's going to be the suffering of rabbits.
Yeah.
Right. It's just that way, right? If there, another example is if there's going to be the good of our climate and atmosphere, then there's going to occasionally be the evil of someone's house being flooded.
Yeah.
Right. Because our atmosphere is such that sometimes, as good as it is for the whole, when you think about how wonderful it is in terms of creating goods for us to eat or food, agriculturally, there's going to be torrential downpours, right? Yeah, and which can cause localized flooding and the destruction of your home, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, and even the fact that, you knew that when you built your house on the beach. That was a risk you took.
That's right.
Like you don't build that's why they build them on stilts, because they foresee, they have the providence to see.
The first time I saw that, I was down in Texas. It was funny.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so keep going here. I'm almost done.
Yeah.
Since then, God provides universally for all being. It belongs to his providence to permit defects in particular effects, that the perfect good of the universe may not be hindered. For if all evil were prevented, much good would be absent from the universe. A
Yeah.
lion would cease to live if there were no slaying of animals, and there would be no patience of martyrs if there were no tyrannical persecution. Thus, Augustine says, Almighty God would not in no wise permit evil to exist in his works unless he were so almighty and so good as to produce good even from evil.
Yeah.
It would appear that it was on account of these two arguments to which we have just replied that some okay, so I'll stop there.
Yeah.
That's a really powerful passage, I think,
Yeah, and I think that's one of the most powerful ones, because another way to look at it is to say, God is so provident and loving and good that he has the ability to bring about an even greater good from a smaller evil.
Right.
And that the world is ordered in such a way that if that smaller evil, or maybe even a great evil, had not existed, it would not have been able to bring about this great good.
Sure.
And I mean, there's a whole lot of trust happening right there.
That's right. That's what I was saying about the deep implications of affirming the existence of God. Right. It brings in a whole different view of yourself, of history, of your personal life. Right. All those sorts of things. Right. Because this extends not just to your personal life, like the betrayal by your friend. Right.
Mm-hmm.
This extends to the history of nations, right?
Yeah.
And I think very instructive, right? That what St. Thomas is bringing up here. And by the way, St. Thomas's view on this is by no means unique. This is a very standard classical view. This saying that there would be no. I want to make sure I can say this again correctly. There would be no patience of martyrs if there were no tyrannical persecution, right? The patience of martyrs, right? That's a great good. The church historically has looked back on the early martyrdoms under Roman persecution, right, as really being the sort of the sources of the growth and holiness of the church, right?
Yeah, the seeds of faith, right? Yeah,
that's absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the glory of the martyrs was something celebrated, by Christians as really kind of being like the energy, the force, right, that eventually overcame the paganism of the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
And if you think about it in that way, the patience of the martyrs was a great good, right? And persecution is evil.
Yeah.
Right. When you think about religious persecution, denying their religious liberty, denying their ability to worship, the one true God, that's evil.
Yeah.
But God brought great good out of it.
Yeah. And if you've listened this far, you must like what we're saying. But if you forget it all, don't forget this line again from Thomas. We'll put it up. Saying, for if all evil were prevented, much good would be absent from the universe. I mean, I think that's a key line, and I think maybe a good analogy. My wife and I, we were talking to some other parents, and we were talking about the one of the many frustrations of being a parent is that there's this idea that we want to give our kids a good holy life, and we want to give them all the great things that the world has to offer, that God has to offer. But we're sitting there realizing that much of the things we want to give them, it's only going to come through them struggling through parts of life.
Sure.
And that's one thing that's difficult for us to deal with, is watching our children suffer in any way. But because we're Christian, we understand that suffering has redemptive value. And sometimes, the only way to become a patient person is to go through the trials of actually being patient.
I
mean, of saying, I have no idea what's going on, but here it is.
That's good.
But I mean, like, again, if you look at the athlete, the suffering of the athlete makes sense because we know the end. We know the end to which they're trying to get. But sometimes our kids don't always see. We're trying to teach them things like moderation. So we're like, no, a fifth soda is not is violating prudence, or something like that, or temperance, temperance. So I mean, like, but our kids, we can't just give them temperance. They have to go through that, and so to them though, it's this great suffering, this great evil that we're denying them the good which they think they see in the soda or something like that. And again, and I love the other line in this that I think really kind of should hopefully kind of give us a way to contextualize it all, is when it's talking about the perfect good of the universe, that the perfect good of the universe may not be hindered. That again, God being first cause, He's created the universe in such a way to where it is aimed towards perfection, and where every part of creation is a means towards that.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
So
I think that's really key, right? Is that there is a perfect goal out there, right? That God is intending, and you can think about that both in kind of like a relatively stable sense about like the perfection of the system of the world, or the perfection of the design of the world. And I think that's certainly true when you bring in kind of heaven, hell, the beatific vision, all those sorts of things, right?
Sure.
But also, and maybe more importantly, right, is the perfection of the narrative, right? That is the perfection of redemptive history. And that's all of this is part of God's plan of redemption and bringing about, the triumph of the city of God, bringing about, the kingdom of God in its fullness, right? In its perfection, with the return of Jesus Christ. So I think, that's something that has to be borne in mind too, when we think about, right, things like persecution, right? The persecution of Christians, we shouldn't go looking for it, right? I'm not interested in that. I occasionally have some friends, who, when looking at the state of the world, think, well, civilization is just going to have to fall completely, and then the church can rise from the ashes. And my response to that kind of thing is like, okay, well, I mean, like if it comes to it, fine, but I'd really like to avoid the ashes. And so, like I'm not looking for persecution here, but if persecution comes, right, it's part of the narrative, right? It's part of the plan.
And you even find that in St. Paul, when he says, God gave them up to their sinful desires. That again, it's not part of the plan, but St. Paul even still puts kind of the emphasis there on God,
right? That's
allowing that.
So when you're thinking about sort of the history of nations, we can kind of start to wrap up here, but it's important to keep that in mind when you think about the history of nations, history of our own country, of the United States of America, of the changes it's gone through and is going through. That's part of God's plan, even if it looks like the changes are bad, right? And certainly there's a lot in American culture and a lot in American politics that causes the wise and the good to tremble, but nevertheless it is part of God's plan, and we may not understand it, we may not like it, we may contend against it, but we have to sort of still see it that way. It's also, and this is what I want to finish with, it's also part of God's plan that you still do your part. So it's important that even if Providence includes persecution, obviously we're not to support that persecution. Because God has arranged that you're a Christian. God has caused you to be a Christian. God has caused you to be a follower of Jesus Christ. And so it's your duty, right? It's your place to contend for Christ, right?
Hmm.
To contend for the Christian faith, even in the face of persecution. Um, to keep honoring God and remaining faithful. Um, in part, maybe that's even why God has permitted, right, the tyranny of the persecution, so that you'll have the opportunity, right, to the occasion, right, to exercise contending for the faith with fortitude
Yeah.
and in the face of danger. Right, there's, as you're talking, having so that you can develop the patience of the martyrs, right? And if we see it's holy in them, then it should also be holy in us, right?
Yeah.
As well, no despair just because your nation is within Providence. Your nation may be going through something that is evil, it does mark a decline, right?
Hmm.
Does mark a corruption. But even so, right, it's still your place to contend for the faith, and to exercise patience, and to avoid despair.
Yeah. And I think, for me, the two things is, when you look at sacred scripture, I mean, those that found favor with God were found favor with God because of their fidelity.
Hmm.
Even if it's just in some of the small miracles and the
Hmm.
gospels.
Right,
Your
right,
faith has saved you. Or
right.
some of the big things like Abraham and Isaac.
Hmm.
It's fidelity that God is looking for. And to use the words of Pope Benedict, success is not one of the names of God. Um,
Hmm.
I love that. I
Right,
really like that line. So, God has asked us to be faithful. Um,
right.
the other thing is, the trust, right? There has to,
Hmm.
and this goes along with faith, that there, you know, in these times, I found myself, trusting in God more and more, because nothing
Hmm.
is, nothing, or a lot of things are not making sense, and
Sure.
the direction to which I am going, or our world is going, our country is going, it's hard to see, so there
Hmm.
has to be some trust, in the one that's driving this car,
Right.
that he knows where he's going and I don't, and
Hmm.
that's okay,
Right,
so
right.
so I think, to me, it's those two things. So trust, and then focus on the faith, and I think those two will help you, and also, like you said, to understand that there was good that came out of the martyrs, there was good
Right.
that came out of the persecution,
Hmm.
and yeah, we just, again, this is why we say, thy will be done,
That's right. That's
right?
right. That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah, yeah.
So, all right, well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about, and go read question 22 there in the Summa, and we'll put a link to it there in our show notes, to point our listeners to. It's rich. I mean, it's
Hmm.
really, really rich. And so, in the meantime, I want to invite once again our listeners, check out Dr. Smith's book on Amazon, Understanding Modern Political Ideas, a guidebook for Christians and ideas. And you can check out his courses in philosophy over at CatholicStudiesAcademy.com. So until next time, God bless.